Welcome to the Restaurant Boiler Room, Season 3, Episode 7. I'm your host, Rick Ormsby, Managing Director at Unbridled Capital. Today in the Boiler Room, I will be sharing some thoughts on how to get a deal completed by year end if you only have a few months and need to accelerate the timeline. How do you cut 20 to 25% of the time out of a typical M&A transaction? I'll also share some thoughts on the resurgence of casual dining, sales and margins in franchise locations, and franchisors' approval processes. The Restaurant Boiler Room is a one-stop shop for multi-million-dollar merger and acquisition activity and financial complexities affecting the franchise restaurant industry. We talk money, deals, valuations, and risk, delivered to the front door of franchisees, private equity firms, family offices, large investors, and franchisors on a monthly basis. Feel free to find our content at Unbridled Capital's website at www.unbridledcapital.com. Now, let's enter the boiler room. Hey, so thanks so much for being here today. It's interesting. It's been a little bit of a crazy summer as I talk with you here towards the end of July, 1st of August of 2021. Our deal flow, man, continues to be absolutely crazy. And it's made it such as this podcast and the webinars that we do have gotten a little bit, just for the temporary time being, have gotten a little bit delayed. So my apologies. I had someone who is a big franchisee out on the West Coast, maybe 100 units or so, tell me yesterday that they missed the last episode of the podcast. And so I'm if you're hearing this, I want you to know that you're my motivation to do this today. And I'm sorry to those of you who have faithfully listened that maybe there's a couple of weeks here where I'm delayed in getting this podcast out. It's been because we're currently, I guess our company closed 5 deals a week and a half ago. We've got 5 more deals that are going to close next week. And so that's a lot, and I'll talk a little bit about kind of some of that right now maybe. But when you're doing a restaurant deal, typically, the last couple of weeks, as you might surmise, are always kind of a fire drill as they're looking to get things closed with closing statements and consents and landlord assignments and franchisor approval and final financing and all the things that have to happen to get a deal closed. And then, it's kind of like this hurry up and wait at times. Many of you are familiar with that. Being in the military at one point in my life, anyone who's in the military understands that, the idea of hurrying up to wait. So that when you have 4 or 5 of them in any one given week, it becomes a bit of a challenge, but it's a blessing to be able to have this kind of work. And it's kind of a testament to maybe what Unbridled's been doing in the marketplace, and also kind of a bigger trend of M&A that's happening after this COVID world we live in with operators. As I've said in prior episodes and in webinars recently, dude, it's been a crazy environment. People have been, sitting on businesses that are all of a sudden doing really well. Many of them have been doing well for almost a year now in the QSR world, right? But certainly in things like fitness and healthcare, and even now in casual dining, sales and profits are starting to pick up quite substantially. And boy, isn't that a blessing and well-deserved. And if you're listening, you're one of those operators who's had a rougher go with the post-COVID fallout, my heart pours out to you, number one. And number two, I'm really thankful to see that things are getting back to normal, and you're probably seeing a big surge once again in your business. And so kudos to you, man, for hanging in there. And it doesn't kill us, makes us stronger. I know for a lot of us, it's been a real rough go. And so kudos to you guys. But, when you get these deals out there and you have the pace of business continuing to be strong, what you see is a little bit of pressure on the timelines. And what's also happened in our business, as I've kind of alluded to in the past, is, and I think across the market in general, it's not individual to us by any means. Matter of fact, it's not individual to us at all. That a lot of clients who have these businesses that are now sitting on 12 months in a row of really strong sales and profits, and looking continuously at the prospect of higher capital gains taxes, in the future. Who knows how much and who knows when or if it'll happen, but most people are saying, at least rumbling, that they hope that any tax changes won't happen until January 1st of 2022 or later. And if that is true, which of course that's a guess, and who the heck knows with politicians and compromising and all the things they do up there, it has pushed a lot of business into this year. It's now as we sit in July, late July, early August, we're 5 months till the end of the year. It typically takes for, most of our clients, our average transaction, soup to nuts, takes about 6 months to close. That doesn't mean that we can't close a deal by the end of the year that starts today, if we're calling today the 1st of August, but it certainly makes it less and less likely. And maybe what I'll do is first start off and talk a little bit about kind of what you have to do to get a deal done quickly. How about that? I don't know that I've spent much time talking about this before, so I'll do that. And to a little bit of context. In most years, and this depends, man. And COVID is one of these things that really put a monkey wrench in the in the normal way of doing things, right? From an M&A perspective too. But if you were to take the 2020 and 2021 out of the picture, and I look at my experience over 20 years in this business, you typically see, a lumpy, big start to the year in February, March, and April, when people just naturally will take their P&Ls, dust them off, talk to their credit committees and their lenders, advisors, and all these people, family members that are close to them and their family partners, and then maybe make a decision to sell a company or refinance a company, and if they're going to sell a company, maybe they get their year-end P&Ls the 1st of February. They make the decision to look at it through the month of February, and 1st of March, let's just say they decide to engage us. And then in that particular situation, the deals close, typically 6 to 7 months, 5 months later, somewhere in that range of the end of Q3, early Q4. And then those kind of deals start happening in March and April. And what it does is set up for a natural cycle of deals that close in the fourth quarter of any given year. And anyone who's in this business as a lender and a deal maker or has bought a lot of things knows that that's kind of a pretty heavy sequence on a yearly basis. And then you typically, have a series of people who decide to sell their companies or do a refinancing action in the fall. I don't know why, but it's a smaller lump, but there is a lump of activity that hits usually in September, October, and November. And then the rest of the business that we do is kind of people make those decisions sprinkled out throughout the balance of the year, and it's more haphazard. Maybe there's someone who dies in the family or a divorce, or maybe there's a circumstance that causes them to act at a given time that's not maybe as planful. Because of that typical sequencing of deals throughout a year, you're going to see naturally a bunch of closings towards the end of the year. And when there's a bunch of closings towards the end of the year, what that typically means is there's year-end pressure to get things done. But the year-end pressure to get things done typically is not as pronounced when there's not tax things at play, right? Like when there's a change in presidency, or when there's an expected tax policy that's either going to phase out or phase in a given tax year. So when those type of events happen, and I can remember that, actually, when Obama was coming into office too, and George W. Bush was leaving. I can remember that kind of being a time when people were pausing on transactions or trying to get transactions to happen more quickly. So that's so it's a kind of a natural time for that to happen. And as a pause right now, I'm doing this podcast, and it's pretty cool. I think most of I live in Gulf Breeze, Florida, which is right around Pensacola and in between Pensacola and Destin. And right now the Blue Angels are flying by. Pretty sweet, man. If you want to get your blood pumping, watch those Blue Angels fly in a sequence of 5 or 6, about 100 or 200 feet off the ground and do their maneuvers. It's pretty impressive. And, back to the discussion, so there's year-end pressure typically, but it's not as big of a pressure until you see a kind of a tax or a regulatory or a political change. Generally speaking, if there's going to be a year-end closing, some sellers actually choose, because of their advice from their CPA or or attorney, to close in the following year. So if something was going to close like December 15th, they may otherwise decide they want to try to close it in January 2nd, right? Because if they close January 2nd, the taxes aren't due until at least April of the following year. And if it's a big set of proceeds and tax law isn't expected to change, effectively by pushing the deal into the first couple of weeks of the next calendar year means that you can hold your money for another 15 or 16 months, maybe longer, before you have to pay the government. And when people are walking away with a tax bill that's going to be $15-20 million, and they can put that money into something that earns a few percent interest, it's a sizable amount. So you see that dynamic a little bit. Of course, buyers typically aren't pushing as hard for the timelines within a calendar year as a seller might. But in this particular year, we are. And some of the things that you have to do right now. So if you do a deal right now, just in this you could throw this in your bag of tricks for whenever you're going to buy or sell, or whenever you're going to raise money, or you're going to lend or finance or seek equity, whatever it is. There are certain triggers that you can maybe be thinking about that would kind of make the timeline go faster. Some of them are creative, and they're not without their faults, but these are just ideas, and I'm not endorsing any one of them. But The first thing you have is, in our process, when we typically take 3 to 4 weeks to uncover the best offers, the right offers, a handful of offers, typically, sometimes less, sometimes more for a given business that's for sale or being financed. And then we typically go through a kind of a 2-week invitation management only kind of meeting. Right now they're going over Zoom, where you might kind of invite 2 or 3 of the buyers to come on Zoom with the seller and answer questions and present themselves and talk about their proposal and who they are and all those things. And then the seller typically chooses the final person to be their buyer of choice. And then we kind of move off into the sunset and try to get the deal closed. Which reminds me of another thing. As a bit of an aside, I would say that those management meetings, if you're like a lot of the people who listen to this podcast are probably buyers or people looking potentially to get into this space. We obviously cater to a lot of Northeastern-based young MBA types who've gotten into the business over the last 4 or 5 years and have bought a ton of restaurants, particularly. Those management meetings are very, very important. Those management meetings are important. And the one thing I would tell you, if you're in one of those management meetings and you get selected, is I'm a sales guy, I'm a numbers guy, but I'm a sales guy too. And I watch these things over and over again. And I'll tell you, it is important when you hop on these management meetings, if you're going to be talking to a seller about a proposal you're giving them and why to choose you, that you talk about the seller more than you talk about yourself. So if you're in an hour-long management meeting and we're sitting on minute number 40 of 60, and you're still talking about who you are and your background and what you've done and all these things and who your company is, you probably spent too much time talking about yourself. You want to be in a position where you talk about yourself. It's the good old typical sales 101, right? You talk about yourself maybe 10 or 15 minutes, maybe at most. You want to introduce who you are. People need to know who you are and what your background is. But then you want to talk about the person and the business and the longevity that you're trying to acquire. Because everyone, at the end of the day, read the Dale Carnegie book, How to Win Friends and Influence People. Everyone wants to hear about themselves, don't they? They don't want to hear about you. So if you're in one of those management meetings, and oh, by the way, if you're one of those young millennial buyers of these businesses, no offense to you if you're listening to this, but you typically probably had a silver spoon in your mouth and you coddled a little bit by mom and dad, and you're used to things being about you, and you're a little and you might be a little self-centered. You might not be naturally the type of person who wants to instead, and you're younger, so you feel a need to justify yourself in front of maybe an operator or a seller who owns a bunch of restaurants who might be in their 60s or 70s, right? But that's maybe not the way to be. The way to be is to ask other people about themselves. Hear, seek to listen first and not talk. Tailor your presentation in a way that you'd want to hear it if you were going to sell something that had been so close to you in a business, like a mother and dad or a spouse or kids over the last 30 or 40 years. Okay, did I kill that? I probably went too heavy on that, man. But so back to this idea of deal activity and timing. So usually we have 3 to 4 weeks of a process, and then 1 to 2 weeks of a management meeting. So let's just say that's 5 or 6 weeks. That 5 or 6 weeks typically takes up, let's call it 6 weeks, right? To choose for a seller to choose the right buyer or the right, financing partner. And, 6 weeks out of a 6-month process. 6 weeks is what? 1.5 months. 1.5 out of 6 is 1/4, right? So that's 1/4 of the time is there. We can usually compress that to 4 weeks, where we can trim the process down to 3 weeks, and the final selection or management team over the course of a couple of days. Maybe we can take that 6 weeks to 4 weeks. That's something that we do, and we can do that pretty effectively. But it takes a lot of long hours and a lot of commitment from the buyer, in agreement with the buyer and seller, to be on hours and hours of meetings from 7 a.m. till 7 p.m. instead of spreading them out over the course of a couple of weeks, if that makes sense. So that's the first thing you can do to effectuate the timeline in a process that's really under compression. The next thing is the LOI. So while I always agree that an LOI needs to be thoroughly reviewed and agreed to by both sides, about half of the time a LOI is kicked back and forth and takes a week to trim up the LOI and get the terms right and redline it, and people want to use attorneys. And so that's a process that we can sometimes shortchange too. It's not something you would prefer to do if you don't have to, but sometimes I've seen clients decide to just basically send emails back and forth and say, okay, the LOI looks fine, let's just move to a purchase agreement instead of negotiating a document that ultimately goes away. The other thing is that, sometimes for the sake of for this, you certainly want to cull out all of the main deal points. If you miss those in the initial stages of a deal, I mean, they're going to come back to bite you, whether you're a buyer or a seller. But nonetheless, abbreviated LOIs may be a better idea if you can verbally go through the main deal points instead of entering attorneys in the middle to negotiate a document and take a week negotiating a document that otherwise it's just going to go away once a purchase agreement is signed. So you might be able to pick up a couple of days there. I'm going to keep a little tally here. So we've saved 2 weeks. Let's say the typical process is 6 to 6.5 months. I'm just going to throw a number out there, right? So we've saved 2 weeks in the selection of a buyer. Maybe we've saved a half a week with this LOI idea. Next thing we do is we go into the purchase agreement. So the purchase agreement itself, so I guess I would say this, I have more and more conviction around this comment that I'm about to make than I ever have. If you choose the wrong attorney to help you, your deal is screwed if you're trying to be on a short timeline. We have one deal now, it's a big one. I won't name it where it is or what brand, but it's a big one. And the asset purchase agreement has been under negotiation for over 90 days. These things are supposed to take 30 days. And most of the reason for, and it probably is going to take another 2 or 3 weeks. So that this APA is going to take 100 to 110 days probably to complete. Dude, that is too long. Like if it's going to take that long, and people who are in the deal business know that that's a ridiculous timeline, it is obvious that you've got the wrong attorney. Now, the problem is once you get into it, you can't really change attorneys. It's very rare to see people do it because of the voluminous amount of work and negotiations that go into agreeing with these purchase agreements. But what it does mean is this. Let me tell you, if you are a buyer or seller, and your attorney has not completed a dozen M&A transactions in the space where, in the franchise space specifically, and can't list them on a page for you, and you're under a time pressure, don't hire them. Just don't hire them. I mean, I don't make legal decisions, okay? So I got to caveat that, but you have to make your own decisions. But time and time again, if I look at a deal board like I have in our office here, kind of a deal sheet, shows 30 deals we're working on. We have a couple of third-party attorneys. We don't get paid for it. I mean, clients make their own decisions, but we have just referrals, people that we know in the business that do a lot of work specifically for M&A and franchise deals. And the 30 deals we've got, probably 20 of them have taken our advice, even when they have their own attorneys, and have hired these third-party attorneys that's all they do. The other 10 don't. Guess what? Of the 20 deals we got going, almost all of them are on track. Of the 10 deals that aren't with that are with the local attorney who might be the real estate attorney or might be the personal attorney of the seller or buyer, half of those deals or more have been delayed at least double, if not 2.5 times what the normal deal is during the asset purchase agreement phase. It is just a major problem. And I have a personal attorney. I know we all have a personal attorney. So, who we trust, who knows our family matters, who has maybe trusts with our family, or has helped us with establishing our LLCs, or has helped us negotiate with our landlords, and all these other things that they've done in personal matters. Maybe helped us, with our taxes too. Whatever it is, we respect them and trust them for it. But it's kind of like kudos to the Milwaukee Bucks for just winning the NBA Finals. I was kind of a Suns fan because of Devin Booker, an old Kentucky player. My son and I love Devin Booker, and they lost. But it's kind of like putting Devin Booker at center. You know what I mean? Devin Booker's a heck of a player. The guy can shoot threes. He's dynamic, electric, but he's like 6'5", and if you put him at center, he's going to be terrible, right? So it's kind of the idea about putting a really good, a trusted attorney who is good for your general business into an M&A transaction that hasn't had experience doing franchise law. They will wreck. In many cases, they will wreck the timeline, even if they are specialized in M&A but haven't the experience of working with a franchisor and working on a franchise transaction. It likely will add 30 to 45 days to the process. So the next thing you can do is you can listen to your advisor, i.e. if you've hired Unbridled, and go through that process of hiring a third-party attorney with experience closing franchise M&A transactions. That's critical. If you don't do that, your deal ain't going to close in 5 or 6 months, except for a few instances. If you do that, you increase the likelihood that the APA process of negotiation lasts between 20 and 45 days, okay? If 20 and 45 days, okay, so how do we spin that and make that faster? There's only limited things you can do, but we can put everyone on notice for every like twice a week phone calls with the parties to try to speed it up and to try to initiate and facilitate business points getting negotiated and agreed to alongside the legal discussion. Because typically speaking, from observation, the legal discussion happens, right? People negotiate the legal language, and then there's 2 or 3 business points that end up being what happens at the very end. And those business points can be typically brought forward sometimes, and they can shorten the process and maybe make this 45-day outside window a 30-day number. And if it's a 30-day number, then potentially we can we can cut a week or 2 off of the process up to the point of APA. Some mutually being signed by the various parties. Okay, so the next part in trying to shorten the timeline of a purchase agreement when you're under pressure, and not just a purchase agreement but a deal, is the third-party diligence that needs to happen. Now, typically in a deal, if you've done deals here in the franchise space, sign a purchase agreement and then due diligence lasts somewhere between 30 and 60 days thereafter. 45 days is common, but that's not what everyone agrees to all the time. Depends on the size and the complexity of the deal. During due diligence, one of the things that if it's a larger transaction, hold on. Whether it's big or small, you have to usually contend with leases, real estate diligence. You've got to get transfer approval from the franchisor, and then you've got to, you got to think about financial diligence. For smaller deals, there's typically not a whole lot of financial diligence. It's typically just internal. The buyer looks at the financials, maybe asks for tax returns, whatever they're going to do, right, and get comfortable with ask for royalty sales from the franchisor. There may be reviewed financial statements from the CPA. And then, they're addressed in the asset purchase agreement, how, the veracity of those documents, and then they move forward. But on the larger transactions and with these bigger groups, especially these groups that are so prevalent these days that have family office money or private equity money, their constituents, whether they be limited partners or whether they be the family that's funding these family office funds, right? They're going to want, in many cases, third-party due diligence financially. So what this looks like is some sort of what's called a quality of earnings study, where maybe a specialty finance group, typically a CPA, comes in for a fee. They come in and they comb through the trial balances and all the P&Ls and all the financial information, and then they are looking to make sure there's no irregularities. And then if they don't find, or whatever they find, they issue a letter that, in most cases to the potential buyer, basically with some sort of guarantee that they haven't found or what they have found. And then the buyer uses that obviously to show their investors or their credit committee so that they feel comfortable affirming the acquisition and the equity and the price and all these sort of things. So that's something that sometimes can be pushed forward a little bit. Potentially, that can take sometimes as long as 30 to 45 days to go through. I've seen some of the quality of earnings last only 3 to 4 weeks. Some last 2 to 3 weeks. So getting those things started sooner is a big deal. Getting the lease assignment started quickly is also a big deal, because if any type of situation where you have to transfer 15 or 20 or 30 leases, there are going to be 10 to 15% of them that are just arduous. It's always that way. You've got Grandma Tilly, she's a third generation landlord, and it was passed down from her great grandfather to her father to whoever, and she's now living in Toledo, Ohio, and doesn't have a cell phone, right? So, or you have, which even worse, in most cases, you have the landlord of some big REIT that owns 7,000 properties out of San Francisco, and you're given some 1-800 number to try to get the lease assigned, right? And it just takes a long time with a lot of bureaucracy. So those are some of the things you definitely want to jump in front of quickly to try to get a week or 2 quicker on the timelines. Sometimes what we're seeing too on the real estate diligence, if there's real estate, you might, and this is a case-by-case basis. Not all buyers and sellers agree to this, but the process of ordering environmentals and surveys and appraisals, happens typically 30 days into due diligence, 15 days into due diligence, but after a purchase agreement is signed. When you're trying to curtail a process, Sometimes maybe you can, come up with a solution where maybe a buyer and seller share the cost of those studies, of those environmentals, of those appraisals, of those surveys, and front end them. If the deal doesn't close, I, Mr. Seller, will help split the cost to defray the cost. I don't know. There's whatever is agreed to between the parties, but the idea is you get those people and those boots on the ground working on those surveys and appraisals sooner than they otherwise would, especially when we're looking at a year-end situation, right, where project forward. Like the busyness for us, being M&A advisors, obviously right now is very busy, but trying to get these things closed, I think we're all getting fearful that as we get into October and November, just these people who inspect facilities, or these people who are doing appraisals. I mean, they have to actually put on their shoes and drive to a location and take pictures of it and do and be there in person to do their work. When they have so many deals that are dependent on year-end closings, those types of people and resources and services are going to be strained pretty dramatically, right? So those are the types of things that you want to try to bring forward as quickly as you can. Facility inspections is another one. Sometimes, if it's a smaller deal or if it's a buyer who knows the seller, sometimes facility inspections just handled in a multitude of different ways. Sometimes it'll be, the buyer will do a casual drive of the stores, and if it's a smaller deal, and maybe bring up some issues, a pothole in the driveway or an AC unit that looks old and defrayed, and try to, use that, kind of to talk about repairs that are needed. If it's a larger transaction, they may do a more formal process and have a third-party inspector come to the table to go and physically look at all the HVAC units, for example, and every one of the 150 units, and then come back with a report of the age and the condition of each HVAC unit in each location. And maybe there are 2 HVAC units in each of the 125 stores. That's 250 HVAC units, right? And so, and the numbers, get to be a little bit larger, but that takes a long time. If you have a large deal, think about having one firm that has maybe 7 or 8 people in their firm going to see 150 units and spending probably 3 or 4 hours at each location, or whatever it would be, and then generating the report. So you want to get those things moved forward as quickly as possible too. If you can kind of front end load the and pull forward and maybe get buyer and seller to agree to start spending money prior to an APA being signed on some of these things like financial due diligence, especially the quality of earnings, or maybe with the appraisals, surveys, environmentals, or maybe with some of the inspections, you can typically shave a couple of more weeks off of the total timeline. So if we're saving 2 weeks in the sales process, and maybe 2 to 2.5 weeks, and then maybe if you get the right attorney, harping on that again, who has experience in franchise M&A and knows how to do these deals, and maybe that shaves 1 to 2 weeks off of the process. Maybe front end loading some of the diligence that I just described may get you another 2 weeks. I don't know. But this is kind of how we're thinking right now, and collectively now, if I'm adding all these darn times together, I'm getting like 6 to 8 weeks, right? So now we're getting kind of some meaningful amount of improvement in the overall time frame. Let's just call it 6 weeks, right? So the other thing that you can do that probably bears thinking about, some, and this is a bigger topic, but the franchisor obviously has the right of first refusal, and then the transfer approval. And for those who are in this business pretty regularly, that most franchisors do not exercise the right of first refusal very often. Now, we probably do business in 10 to 15 brands, pretty regularly, and I have personally in a 20-year career seen a right of first refusal exercised less than 5 times in maybe 2 or 3 brands total. So it's not something that happens a lot. And as you all know, we could talk about this for ad nauseum for hours probably, but the model has historically been, in the last 4 or 5 years, it's called asset light model. The franchisor wants to sell as many assets and have as low a percentage of corporate ownership as possible, usually in the 5% range, to be able to test market, to be able to have, to be able to have a critical piece of operations and some credibility with the franchisees, but they don't want to have a big operation because the money is in the royalty stream, and the higher multiple, the higher value of the company for the franchisor is in the royalty stream, not in the company operations. But nonetheless, nonetheless, going to the franchisor is always something that is different. So in some brands, the franchisor will render the right of first refusal and start their clock, whether it's 30, 45, or 60 days based on a signed LOI. Well, that's pretty good, especially if you're a buyer who's coming into a deal and you don't know the brand or you haven't been approved in the brand beforehand, right? So that's interesting and something to note. But most brands want a signed APA beforehand. So is it possible in those brands to go to the franchisor and to plead the franchisor to start the approval process and to start the right of first refusal process prior to getting the APA? Well, they probably won't do it, but maybe they'll tee the deal up. Maybe there are some things that can be done to squeeze a week or so in the process. The other thing is, if you are a franchise, if you were going to get into a franchise brand for the first time and you're a buyer, most of these brands, and this is another topic that I may talk about today actually later on, but maybe not. If not, listen next time. It's about what franchisors are demanding from, or how they're looking for the approval process for new franchisees. They're obviously getting a little bit more aggressive in the demands that they want. If you're a new franchisee, no longer is it, will we approve you or not? There is that, but then after that, it's, if we approve you, will you sign relations? What kind of agreement can we get out of you to guarantee that you won't sell the assets for the, not everyone's like this, but most franchisors want to extract a pound of flesh to get you to agree to development and remodeling schedules that may be really accelerated or pretty aggressive. And they also want to try to tie you into not being able to sell the assets for a certain amount of years after buying them. At least some of the franchisors are that way. And that, some franchisors will call that a relationship agreement, which is kind of a term for an agreement where we're going to ask a whole lot of you in exchange for our agreement to let you buy these stores that you're trying to buy. So those are some of the things that take a long time. Some of these relationship agreements with these new franchisees, they can take a while. So I wouldn't be surprised. We've seen several transactions where the relationship agreement takes somewhere between 30 to 45 days in addition to the approval process just to get negotiated, depending on the depth and scope of it. There are a couple of law firms that are out there that we know who actually specialize in negotiating these relationship agreements. So they're pretty healthy documents, and of course, since they involve these family offices and private equity groups and the general partner and limited partners, and they define that relationship and the financial commitment that must be made to the brand, it is a very important document for these groups. The point is, you got to get out in front of it and get out in front of it quickly. A good advisor is going to point that out to you, and a good advisor is also going to give you some thoughts about the conditions under which the relationship agreement typically is invoked, and because what you don't want to do is be 30, 60 days into a transaction working on a purchase agreement with the seller, only to find out 30 days later that the brand that you're going to try to buy these stores in is going to require something that your charter with your investors just won't allow, or they'll be asking for remodel requirements that you just physically will not ever agree to. It is obviously true in many cases that the relationship agreement is negotiated. The development requirements, the remodeling requirements, and all of these things, depending on the brand, depending on the time, depending on just kind of the leadership in the brand and the franchisee who's approaching the matter. So this is all stuff that takes time to unfold, and it can't be viewed as anymore as something that is at the end of the transaction. I think historically, I've been doing this a while, right? So when I first started doing M&A, especially with the Young Brands franchisees, it was kind of an afterthought, the franchisor approval process. You kind of worked almost linearly, right? You found yourself, if you're a seller, you found yourself a buyer, you negotiated the price, you signed an LOI, you signed an APA. Once you got the APA signed, you threw it into corporate. That was really the first time you gave them a buzz, and you let them know that there's going to be a possible transfer happening, and you bringing in a buyer for this business. And then you're working on then you're finalizing your financing and you're working on your leases. That's kind of the way it used to be. But it doesn't happen linearly like this anymore, because the franchisor over the years has kind of tightened like a python, right? A constrictor. And they want more control. They certainly want new unit development. their ask has started ramping up again post COVID. Generally speaking, across all the brands I see, for probably a year when COVID happened, all the development ask kind of sort of stopped and went on pause because, as everyone knows, it's difficult to get money. No one's going to be building new units, when there's a middle of a pandemic and you can't get people to do it. But now that we're starting to see the franchisors kind of beat the drum. They're beating the drum. They want the requirements. They're noticing both in their own P&Ls, but also in the franchise royalties they're getting paid, and the phone calls and all the work that they're doing with the franchisees. That the franchisees have money. They have the PPP loan money. Their sales and EBITDA, especially on the QSR side, are really high right now. And so the franchisors who are incentivized for new development, what do you think they're going to do when they know all that information, right? They're going to be pushing everybody to build more units. And I think, as a condition of transfer, it's going to become a bigger issue, and they're taking a heavier hand. And so here's where I'm going to go ahead and keep talking about the franchisors. In several brands that we've been working on in several deals over the last 30 days, 20 days, maybe 30 days. Two brands I can think of particularly, I won't name them. They had a franchisor who, for the first time I've seen in many, many years, had declined a franchisee to buy a business, even when the buying franchisee was well capitalized and a great operator and approved in the system. Because they didn't want stores to be bought non-contiguous from where the current franchisee's operations are. So that's something across now several brands that you have to consider. It's a question to ask your advisor, right? Like, if I'm a buyer and I own Jimmy John's in Dallas, is Jimmy John's going to allow me to buy Jimmy John's restaurants in Columbus, Ohio? And I don't know the answer to that question particularly, but many brands are going to put restrictions if you're an existing franchisee on where you can acquire, and some will base it based on your operations scores, obviously, and your growth approval status, your financial status, but increasingly, where do you currently operate stores? And where are you proposing to buy more stores? And it's part of the equation of not wanting to have franchisees all over the place. And I think part of it gets back down to, number one, they think it's protecting the brand, the franchisors do. But number two, I think that's a formula for them for development, right? So they want to bring in new franchisees or people who are nearby that they feel like can develop more stores more aggressively. So that's going to be what I've noticed. And also I've noticed that franchisors are just not as friendly anymore to buyers, even well-qualified buyers, if who aren't in the system. Working on a deal right now where, there might be 5 buyers who've come to the table on a big deal and none of them are franchisees in an existing brand. We know now to call the franchisor and guess what? The franchisor had a really healthy opinion on several of these potential buyers, right? So the franchisor is really exercising more authority and control. I go back to the constrictor or the python analogy. And my son's a tennis player, and so I would say you could either beat you could beat your opponent in tennis one of two ways. You can beat him one way by striking like a cobra, you know what I mean? That would be like pounding the forehand, and just hitting winners on people, right? Or to be real aggressive. And then, our good friend, he's not our good friend, but Novak Djokovic, who just won his 21st Grand Slam championship, like he beats people typically by squeezing them like a python, right? Constricting, returning the ball over and over and over again, hitting it to your backhand 100 times in a row until you falter and you make a mistake. So, I think the methodology here is that you're seeing more franchisors with a little bit of constricting going on, wanting more control, and coming out of this COVID circumstance with more control. Sounds similar to our government, doesn't it? Oh, by the way, so on to another topic. But so those are, and I think that's finally kind of how you think about reducing the time frame to get a deal done when you only have 4 to 5 months and you usually take 6 or 6.5. It is true now that we're starting to hear rumblings that some franchisors are saying, hey, if you don't get your deal into us by X amount of date, we're not going to be able to, guarantee that it'll close by 2021. So they're feeling the pressure too. You all know too, in the age of corporate restructuring and downsizing and G&A reductions, these franchisors don't have much staff. And usually, you're dealing with middle managers who are getting paid, $125,000 a year salary, who are standing in front of $200 million deals. So it's kind of a weird kind of circumstance, isn't it? Wouldn't you think you'd put more G&A and more attention and bigger and better resources against such big deals when they're so important to your system? But that's the way it's kind of staffed these days. And so you've got to it's almost like working through aides at a politician's office, not the politician himself or herself. So those are kind of the things you have to think about. Overall, I do think we're going to see some theatrics here in Q4. I don't know what's going to happen as we get towards the end of the year and we have like 100 deals in the franchise M&A world that have to happen in the final 3 weeks of the year. So, strap on your boots and get ready. I think it'll be an interesting, end to the year for sure. A couple other things I kind of would just point out as I finish up here. One would be, I've heard a couple of comments that are interesting. One comment I've heard recently, for buyers, is that we are addicted to depreciation, and that's why we're continuing to acquire. Isn't that interesting? So these are the kind of first and second generation self-made franchisees that are growing. These are guys that are probably a lot different than the family offices, but depreciation is a beautiful thing for people who own businesses, and being able to depreciate goodwill and FF&E and leasehold improvements and even real estate to a lesser extent is a powerful reason why people who are creating multi-generational family-owned businesses want to continue to buy, especially with a lot of debt and especially when interest rates are really low. So I thought, there's who is it, Robert Palmer? Remember that song, man, in the 80s? Was it in the 80s maybe? Yeah, might as well face it, I'm addicted to love. You remember that song? But it should be addicted to depreciation, right? Might as well face it, I'm addicted to depreciation. Maybe that's a good t-shirt. So that's something to be thinking about. I do think we're going to start seeing a casual dining resurgence. So this is just a total, I've got like a yellow pad here of 5 or 6 things I wanted to chat about. So the rest of it's going to be fairly short, but casual dining is starting to see a little bit of resurgence. I don't think we have any really robust lenders who are raising their hands yet and saying, ooh, me, I'm willing to finance casual dining deals. I want to go out and, refinance an Applebee's deal of 150 units. No, I don't think there's a lot of that just yet, but I do think the performance in casual dining has obviously shown some big improvements. A lot of casual diners who I know, who I'm chatting with, are starting to see their sales that are, in excess of 2019 levels. I think the bar for casual dining that I'm sure lenders and advisors and investors all alike and franchisors are all looking at are, in many casual dining brands in 2016, 17, 18, and 19, the trends weren't great, were they, right? They were really taking a hit. And so what do the trends look like coming out of COVID? If we were exempt the COVID blip and all the bad stuff that happened to dine-in restaurants during that time, what's going to happen here in the next 3 to 6 months in casual dining? I mean, do we have any conviction or any data that's going to show us that the trends are going to be reversed and actually there's going to be a little bit of a step change and people are going to go back to casual dining in a big way? I don't know. I think there's opinions all over the board. I was just talking with a dear friend of mine who's a big franchisee the other day, and he says, hey, maybe this Thanksgiving and this Christmas, you're going to see more people piling into O'Charlie's, Applebee's, and Chili's than you've ever seen before. And I can understand that sentiment, right? It may be true. Does that create a long-term trend? Like anything else with QSR or any other brand that we saw during COVID, you then have an opportunity to get a new client or a new customer or a lapsed customer in the door and wow them with your service and with your food. And if you do that, maybe it can create a long-term, growth in business and a change in the way it's been, which has been a slow decline over the last 4 or 5 years. So watch out for the casual dining resurgence and see how that may, translate to more deal flow in 2022. We'll see. What's going to happen to sales and margins as dining rooms reopen? That's kind of starting to happen right now. A lot of P&Ls have been looking really good because there hasn't been much labor spent inside the dining room recently, and so it's kind of a double-edged sword, isn't it? A lot of the, I wonder what the sales will do. I mean, you would suspect that when you open your dining rooms, you're going to be getting higher sales. How much higher sales? How many people are going to be coming back to a QSR dining room that previously for the last year and a half have just basically gotten accustomed to only eating QSR through the drive-through or delivery? That's a question. How much sales will be new in the dining room, or will it shift away from the drive-through and delivery? That remains to be seen. And then what's going to happen to profitability? Obviously, you got to have more people staffed to clean the dining rooms and to keep them fresh and ready and everything good to go for the employees. For the customers. So, I think we're going to have a perspective on that in the next couple of periods as we look at EBITDA here and we look at sales. Keep an eye on that. I'll talk about that probably as we get into Q3 and Q4. I will say that we have seen that some sellers are a little bit, this is another point, some sellers are a little bit greedy. I would remind those of you who listen to this, if you are a seller, remember that if you're in some businesses now, I want to be sensitive to the fact that if you were a fitness franchisee and you're listening to this, you had a really rough go in COVID. If you're a casual dining franchisee, you had a really rough go. If you were, a lot of these health and beauty, franchisee, you had a really rough go, and you're just getting back. You deferred a lot of rent payments. You probably didn't pay the franchisor their full royalty. You probably, the bank has probably not been paid fully over that time period. And so you've been hurting, and now you're getting back to a point where you're finally getting cash flow in your doors, hopefully. So good for you guys. So this doesn't apply to you as much as it does the QSR operators we see regularly, who are forgetting, I think, that their business may be up 20 to 25% or whatever it is in value, over the last 18 months. And they were happy of the value of their business back in 2019. So in 2021, be happy of the value of your business because it's higher than what you ever could have expected, right? And so, sometimes greed is a nasty little thing. It's a nasty, was it 5-letter word? GREED. Yeah, it's a nasty little thing, nasty little 5-letter word. So let's not forget where we come from. You know what I mean? It's like a good old country boy forgetting his roots and kind of hating on his hometown, right? Let's not forget where we came from. If you're in a position where you have a business that's all of a sudden more attractive than it used to be, man, don't forget, and also be grateful where you are. Don't be greedy. So that's I hope people hear that. I know this is going to be at the end of the presentation or, today's podcast, but I hope people hear that. I may have to start repeating that every time. And then the last thing is, let's just keep an eye on the workers coming back, man. I think the labor problem hopefully will continue to, the word on the street is it's starting to get a little better out there, which I think is fantastic for, people are coming back to work as the unemployment benefits are kind of getting cut off, especially in the southern states over the early part of the summer. I hear some of my friends who are operating big franchise businesses down south are starting to say that they have less positions to fill and more people applying now. Which, when the money is cut off, of course, people go back to work. But I think it's a good sign, and hopefully we'll see the labor market start to moderate here as we push into the end of Q2, Q3 area. And I hope that means good things for everybody, workers and franchisees, employers, employees, everybody alike. We want this thing to get back to normal for everybody involved. So I appreciate you guys listening today, and look forward to talking with you soon. Thanks so much for entering the Boiler Room today. You can find our podcasts on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, and Spotify. If you like these podcasts, please listen, rate, and review. I also encourage you to visit our website at www.unbridledcapital.com for the best franchise M&A and financial resources in the industry. Our website includes webinars, podcasts, videos, white papers, and a list of our past M&A transactions. Please note that neither Rick Ormsby nor Unbridled Capital Advisors LLC give legal, financial, or tax advice. These podcasts represent opinions that have been prepared for informational purposes only. We expressly disclaim any and all liabilities that may be based on such information, errors therein, or omissions therefrom.